none of you has a job that is more important than the spiritual training of your children. The world, you must understand, is filled with ideologies that are competing against you for the minds of your children. Are you winning the battle? As parents, you should be the most powerful influence in your child's life. The story about Eli emphasizes this spiritual truth that I really want to communicate to the men who are listening. Fathers, God has laid the responsibility for providing your children with spiritual instruction at your feet. It's not to say that your wife has no responsibility, but God has placed the primary responsibility, indeed the one that he will hold accountable, is fathers.
You know, I've spent my career taking on some of the cultural baddies, you know, some of the most prominent intellectuals in the world, some of them in public debate, some of them behind the scenes. And I've come to realize that ideas define everything that we do. With an academic degree, you're trained to be a researcher and writer to the point that it's annoying. But I'm grateful for it. I'm not talking about books I've not read. I'm not talking about papers I've not read. Whether I agree with them or not actually isn't the point. There are quite a few books that I would read that I would say are actually evil books. Donald Trump, when he was in a divorce with his first wife, she said he has a copy of Mein Kampf next to his bed. I wish more people did. If the German people had bothered to read that book rather than just have it on their shelf, we might have avoided the Holocaust. If more people read the Quran, they'd be wiser to what Islam actually is, what they actually believe. If people bothered to read, as I have, the writings of Klaus Schwab and the various contributors to the World Economic Forum and the ideas that are driving the globalists, I read them because I want to understand their mentality. I cut out the middleman. I go straight to the ideology. Everything in your life is being defined by either your ideas or the ideas of the people around you. And each episode, we're going to be digging into a different idea that appears in the culture. This is Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.
And today we are talking about America's youth. How do we reclaim America's youth? This issue for me is, if not the issue, it is close to being the top issue that we are dealing with in our culture and that must be addressed if America, indeed, if the West is to be saved. And that is because the left have deliberately targeted and cynically used America's youth by indoctrinating them with all kinds of nonsense. If you wonder how we got where we are, culturally speaking, politically speaking, it starts there. It starts in the classroom. I think it was Abraham Lincoln that said the philosophy in the schoolroom in one generation is the philosophy of government in the next. And he was absolutely correct about that. But I'll go further. The philosophy in the schoolroom in one generation is the philosophy of the family. It's the philosophy of the church, if there is one, in the next generation. It is the philosophy of society as a whole in the next generation. And so much of my career has been spent with youth. It was my privilege, going through graduate school. I was taught in university for a time, taught Western civilization, taught an elite preparatory school for many years. And one time in my in my life, I was a youth minister, and we've hosted Fixed Point Foundation. We've hosted many of our own youth conferences and Bible studies over the decades that have been very successful. And then, of course, add to that I've spoken on loads of campuses. So I've had lots of engagement with American youth, foreign as well, but we're talking about America today. But the rules that I'm going to lay out, the principles that I'm going to lay out, apply to any child anywhere in the world. And I want you to consider these. Now, let me start by telling you this story. In 1994, I went hiking. It was the spring of 1994, and I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in the Smoky Mountains. And the plan for this particular weekend called for a 30-mile hike over the course of 3 days, where we would descend down the mountain, make our way to Cades Cove. Some of you will have been there. It's a very beautiful place. And according to meteorologists, the weather was to be partially cloudy with a few scattered showers. And tragically, the meteorologists, they were wrong. Initially, the rain was light, and it wasn't really a source of concern. But by the second day, it was raining much harder, and the weather became violent, really violent. Flash flooding down trees forced us to change our route. On the third day of our deliverance-like experience, no dueling banjos, thank God, I rounded a bend in a trail, and I saw a guy, a young man, who was pacing back and forth. I was thrilled to finally see another human being, and I saw his backpack. I saw that it was a day pack, which indicated I must be pretty close to civilization at this point. But there was something disquieting about this figure. I realized the closer I got to him, he was running his hands through his hair, and he was muttering, to himself. And as I approached, I asked him how close it was, or how far rather, to Elkmont Campground. And he said his eyes were really blank. And he responded in a broken, uneven voice. And he said, it's not far, but first we have to cross that. And he turned and pointed at what looked to me like the Mississippi River. White water was cascading down out of the mountains, pounding everything in its path. It was deafening. According to our map, there was no river on this trail. Small creek, but no river. Nature had forged it overnight. 12 inches of rain overnight. The young man began speaking very rapidly. He told me that he had been hiking with a friend, but they'd split up to try to find a way across the river. They planned to meet a half hour later, but his friend, after several hours, had still not returned. So I turned to my friend, who was suffering from hypothermia. He was older than me and wasn't in particularly good shape, wasn't ready for, it was very funny. He was an attorney, and he was himself suffering from hypothermia. And I said, you needed to be in shape for this. He said, I thought walking back and forth from my office to the courthouse would be enough. That was like a 2-block walk. So he himself was suffering, but he was clear-headed. And I said to him, why don't you stay here with him and set up a tent, and both of you get inside of it, get out of the rain, and I'm going to go and look for his friend. And so I did. And for hours, I looked for his friend. And then just as darkness was descending, I noticed out in the water, and again, this is, deafening. It's deafening, the white water crashing down out of the mountains. I noticed what appeared to be a backpack underneath a rock out in the middle of this, Mississippi River-like, torrent, coming out of the mountains. And I managed to get out onto, jumping from rock to rock. I managed to get out onto this very large escarpment, really, and reaching over it, grabbed the backpack and pulling up on it, feet came up out of the water, boots. And I realized that the young man was still wearing the backpack and that he was dead. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7 says this: you shall teach them diligently to your children and talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall speak of them diligently, meaning God's laws. Some of you will remember that storm. Those of you who are from the South, you'll remember that storm of spring 1994, because 44 people across the South were killed, and this young man was one of them. The following morning, the rain had abated and the water was receding, and a team of park rangers were there now, and were in the process of trying to remove the body from the water. Overnight, there had been 2 other hikers, and they were on the other side, separated from these 2. And when their friends didn't show up, they went to a ranger station and reported them as missing. So I don't know, sometime after dark, these Rangers appeared on the other side of the river, and I couldn't hear them. They were using a loudspeaker, but it was just, it just sounded like, Charlie Brown, adult voices. I couldn't really understand anything. And so they would put notes with a rock in a Ziploc bag and throw it across, launch it across the river to me, one time hitting me right in the shin. And it had questions on it like, what's your name? Who's the body in the water? Are there any other people? This type of stuff. And I would write on it and send it back. And they took it back to the ranger station where these other two hikers were. And they said, do you know these people? And they said yes. And they were able to identify who the person was in the water. And so the Rangers called that boy's father, that dead boy's father. They called him overnight. He was in Dallas, as I recall. He flew to Knoxville. And the next morning, as that 17-year-old boy who was on spring break from the University of Georgia his body was being winched out of the water. He was being pulled up just like this. I will never forget the look of grief on the face of that father as he watched his son being taken out of the water. Unimaginable grief at the loss of his son, at the loss of his child, and then to be there, to see that. I've often wondered about that man, and I've often wondered what he had taught his son. I've often wondered about his son, what his son believed, who he was, because you see, in a moment, the only thing that mattered was this: had he taught his son about Jesus Christ? Had he taken the words of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7 seriously and diligently taught his son of God's law and pointed him to Jesus Christ? Because you see, in a moment, any future promise his son might have shown as an artist, as a pianist, as a lawyer, as a scientist, as a husband, as a father, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered in that moment was whether or not his son had a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that brings me to this question for you. Is the spiritual training of your children your number one parental priority? I was just talking to my friend Lawrence Fox about this very thing, and he said, Larry, your show's called Ideas Have Consequences. You should call this episode today, Parenting Has Consequences. And boy, does it. It's a brilliant comment by my friend. It's just dead on. Parenting, or a lack of parenting, has consequences. At certain times, wise investors look for stability. Markets are overinflated, inflation remains a concern, and global tensions continue to rise. That's why many are turning to the safety of physical gold and silver. Alpha Omega Gold is a Christian-owned precious metals company known for honesty, transparency, and biblical stewardship principles. Their team help clients protect their investment with integrity and clear guidance, never pressure. Right now, Alpha Omega Gold is offering a free precious metals navigation guide to explain why owning gold and silver can be a smart, strategic hedge for retirement accounts and long-term security. Don't wait until economic shifts impact your future. So today, go and visit www.ao.gold/IHC. Or call 855-4AO-GOLD. That's 855-426-4653. Call today to learn how simple it can be to secure what matters most. You see, unfortunately for most Christians, and it's everyone that I'm speaking to here, but it's chiefly to Christians to which I speak on this particular occasion. Unfortunately for most Christians, parenting, teaching their children, spiritually equipping them, isn't their number one parental priority. If this man was like most, he probably said that he didn't have time for such endeavors. His work kept him too busy. Some of you will recall the old song by, his name's gone straight out of my head, but it will come to me hopefully before the end of the Harry Chapin. Is that his name? Harry Chapin, The Cat's in the Cradle. The Cat's in the Cradle and a Silver Spoon, Little Boy Blue and the Man in the Moon. When you coming home, Dad? I don't know when, but we'll get together then, son. I know we'll have a good time then. We're going to read the lyrics of that song. They're just absolutely dead on in this. And that song ends with him saying, I called up my son and told him I'd like to see you if you don't mind. He said, I'd love to, Dad, if I had the time, but the new job's a hassle and the kids got the flu. But it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you. And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me, my boy was just like me. He'd grown up just like me. That's the typical parent. That's the typical parenting story. Is that a valid excuse? Well, there are two kinds of busy, and a distinction must be made between them. The first is what I call real busy. By real busy, I mean substantive, not imagined, but real. A person who falls into this category is busy for reasons that are beyond his or her control. This person works extraordinary long hours, perhaps more than one job, not because they want to, not by choice, but because they have to, just simply for subsistence. The second kind is what I call elective busy. The person who is elective busy bustles themselves or their kids from one activity to another, not out of necessity, but by choice. They work long hours not because they need the additional income, but because they want it. Do you see the difference? Do either of these describe you? If you fall into the first category, you can say that you do not have time to, and you feel like you don't have time to train your children. Pray that God will provide you that time and he'll bless the time that you do have. If, however, you fall into the second category, finding time is not your problem. Priorities are your problem. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, Americans today have more leisure time than any generation of Americans in the history of this country. That translates to roughly 40 hours a week. And by leisure time, I mean time. They mean time that is spent doing whatever you want to do. You might choose to work during that time, or you might choose to play golf or, watch TV. So how do most of us spend that time? Well, 20 hours, half of that time is spent just watching television. 20 hours. 10 hours is spent socializing. Socializing matters. At least good socializing can be very important. But where do children and family rank on this list? Well, Americans devote so little time to this area that it did not merit mentioning. It did not merit mentioning. But maybe television isn't your obstacle. Perhaps work is your number one priority. In his book, Straight Talk, the late Dr. James Dobson talks about how his career received a jolt from the 1969 publication of his book, Dare to Discipline. The book was an instant success, and Dobson received invitations to speak from all across the country. He was youth superintendent at his church. His responsibilities at USC School of Medicine increased, and he served on a number of boards and committees. And while it was not uncommon for him to go for several days without seeing or interacting with his wife, Shirley, and his daughter, Danae, he told himself that what he was doing was for them. For as his career advanced, so did the financial rewards, and they would surely benefit from that. His father, however, was not impressed. He had observed the hectic lifestyle of his son and felt obliged to express some concern. And he wrote him this letter. Dear Jim, Danae is growing up in the wickedest section of a world much farther gone into moral decline than the world into which you were born. I've observed that the greatest delusion is to suppose that our children will be devout Christians because their parents have been, or that any of them will enter into the Christian faith in any other way than through their parents' deep travail of prayer and faith. But this prayer demands time that cannot be given if it is all signed and conscripted and laid on the altar of career ambition. Failure for you at this point would make mere success in your profession a very pale and washed out affair indeed. James Dobson Sr.'s letter to his son is grounded in spiritual truth. First is the fact that we live in a culture that's much worse than 1969, that has rejected Christian principles and is, as a consequence, in a state of moral decay. Second is the fact that it is possible, may even likely in some instances, depending on what you're doing with your children, it is possible for mothers and fathers to love God and systematically lose their children. You can be a church officer, tithe 30% of your income, teach Sunday school, and come to church every time the doors are open and still fail to communicate the real meaning of the Christian faith to the next generation. Eli, in Scripture, Eli was just such a man. He was so busy with church, with the temple, that he neglected his family. In 1 Samuel 2, we are told that his sons did not know the Lord and that they were wicked. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, the Lord says this, "In that day I will perform against Eli all that I've spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them." Many of you have responsible jobs and must be taken very seriously. There's nothing wrong with that. And there is certainly nothing wrong with working hard. Indeed, Colossians 3:23 commands that you do so. But none of you has a job that is more important than the spiritual training of your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren. Now, you may think that bringing your children to Sunday morning worship and youth group is all the spiritual training that they need. It is not. Apparently, that's what Eli thought. Perhaps Eli thought that taking his children to the temple was all the spiritual training that they needed. But it doesn't work that way. The sad fact is that for most children, the bulk of their spiritual training comes from the church rather than from their parents. And some of you are thinking right now, well, shouldn't it come from the church? No. The church should be the garnish on the plate. Your spiritual training needs to be the entree. What they're doing should be supplementing and reinforcing what you are doing, what you are teaching in your home. Recently, Lori and I hosted a couple who lamented the loss of their children to the LGBT movement. These parents love the Lord. They're good people. They were raised in the church and raised their children in the church. And yet, one by one, their three beautiful daughters rejected the Christian faith. I asked the mother, if you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently? And she said this, and she told me I could say this on this episode. We wouldn't assume our children receive the faith through osmosis. And see, this is what James Dobson Sr. is saying in his letter, is this: I have observed that the greatest delusion is to suppose that our children will be devout Christians because their parents have been. The faith is not handed down from generation to generation through osmosis. Let that sink in. And that story is all too common. I meet with parents like this all the time who often ask me to intervene with their own children. And I often say to them, you're placing too much hope in what you think a conversation with me is going to do, because at the end of the day, it's not going to be about me outwitting them. They're going to do what they want to do. They are going to do what they choose to do. And often what they choose to do is what they've been allowed to do for far too long, until they're now outside of your control and you no longer have the ability to discipline them. Parents, discipline is exceedingly important. And I'm making a distinction between discipline and punishment. Discipline and punishment. When you're disciplining a child, you are preparing that child's heart. You're molding their heart. You're training them. And by the way, James Dobson's book, Dare to Discipline, is a great book. It's worth reading now. It's probably better than 99% of the things you're going to find out there about parenting. The story about Eli emphasizes this spiritual truth that I really want to communicate to the men who are listening. Fathers, God has laid the responsibility for providing your children with spiritual instruction at your feet. It's not to say that your wife has no responsibility, or grandparents. Grandparents, you do have a responsibility. But God has placed the primary responsibility, indeed the one that he will hold accountable, is fathers. It's fathers. Notice who God called on the carpet, who the Lord called on the carpet in 1 Samuel 3. It wasn't Eli's wife. It was Eli. So how are you doing in this area? Perhaps one way is to find out is to answer this question. Who or what is the most powerful influence in your child's life? Who or what is the most powerful influence in your child's life? You answer that question and you will know how you are doing. Is it social media? I cannot help but notice that the so-called experts, while giving weak acknowledgement of that social media is problematic, they rush to speak of its benefits. I see none whatsoever. In prepping for this presentation, I went and looked at one of the foremost medical authorities in America, perhaps in the world, the Mayo Clinic. And the Mayo Clinic, talking about social media, that made no argument, as they should have, for why children should not be on it, why they should not have smartphones, why they should not have access, unimpeded access to the internet ever. Instead, it went on to say, there's some things that can be problematic, but it's so great. I cannot imagine what America's youth, I can imagine what America's youth are accessing online and how other people are accessing them. You see, dads, I think most dads do what I do. I've been told I'm hyper-vigilant. Nature of my work makes me that way. But I think I was born that way. My wife says that, Ranger, my German Shepherd, is my spiritual animal. Spirit animal, I think that, isn't that the term, spirit animal? Insofar as maybe I'm sort of the human equivalent of Ranger. I'm on guard. I sit with my back to the wall. I don't go to bed until all the chickens are in the coop. I check all the doors. I hear a noise, I'm investigating. I see something strange, I'm going to take a look. And I think a lot of dads do this much. When Junior is out, you've given him the keys to the car, or the daughter is out on a date, you don't go to bed. Your wife might, but you don't go to bed until they're back in the house. And you've seen them head to their room. And you go, okay, now I can rest, now I can relax. When my children were out, I did not sleep until they were home. I might even be laying in bed, but I'm awake, and I'm listening for the garage door to open, or I'm listening for the front door to open. And then I check the doors, the outer doors, and then I peek in on them. Did you do that? Of course you did. Parents, today, there's another door that most of you are leaving unguarded, and that is the internet. It just allows all kinds of trash to come straight through your doors, right into your house, and access your children, and pours garbage, sewage, straight into their heads. You must be vigilant about this, and you cannot parent according to what everybody else is doing. Lori and I made some real tough decisions early on. We made the decision to homeschool our children, which I honestly think is what every parent should be doing. And don't give me a bunch of crap about how you can't afford it. I made $28,000 a year, and we lived off of that. Our children never spent a day in daycare. We just simply prioritize, this is what we're going to do. And if we have to eat ramen noodles, we'll eat ramen noodles. I can recall, finding a $5 bill in a pair of pants and thinking, I'm rich. I got some money. We can buy some milk. I mean, this was our reality, but we had decided we were committed and I really have to give credit to my wife, Lori, here. We were committed to raising our children at home. We had assistance from some grandparents and so on to watch them from time to time when things were coming up. Sometimes I'd be driving to work. Lori might be coming back from, she worked weekends as a nurse. We would stop midway at a Texaco station. I would take the car seat out of my car, put it into her car, and she'd head on. I would be, on my way to class or on my way to work. I mean, we did what we had to do. We simply made it a priority. And God bless that. God absolutely, absolutely bless that. But we were just on the front end of the internet. And these days, this is the kind of thing that parents just simply have to say no to that. And when we decided to homeschool, there were people who thought, this was in the day where it seemed like it was Branch Davidian. Like it was, we were members of some kind of crazy cult. Nobody thinks that now of our children, but they thought it at the time because it just seemed, everybody just unthinkingly sent their kids off to public schools or to Christian schools. Today's Christian schools are what my public school was like when I was a child. Things have changed. But still, I would argue that scripturally, nowhere does God say that you should subcontract the education of your children. Now, you can go and gnaw on that. You can send me nasty notes and say what you want. But I'm telling you that the consequences of sending your children out to be educated by other people will have very serious consequences. Chief one will be, you will not be the most influential person in their lives. Is it television? And again, by the way, just to make my point really clear there, what I'm trying to say to you is sometimes you have to make choices as a parent that may have social repercussions, that your friends, make little snide remarks to you or mark you off of a party list, or something because they don't like what you're doing or they tell you it's weird. At the end of the day, I'm accountable to God, not to the people I go to church with or to my neighbor or what somebody has to say about me online. I'm accountable to God. And to that extent, I'm going to follow my conscience as it relates to these things, or at least I should, you see. So you have to make some really hard choices. And I hear parents say, well, the reason we let our daughter have a smartphone is because all her class, they all have them these days. If you try to stand against it, I mean, people just say that, it's just hard. I just say, well, it actually isn't. You just say, no, you won't have one. And I don't care. I don't care what your friends have at school. That isn't the way we're doing things in this household. And I promise you, you may have a fight with your children initially, but they will respect you for it when they understand what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. Is television the most influential thing in your child's life? Well, let's hope not. I mean, I don't really have to tell you the negatives, but it has been the children sitting in front of a screen has been attached to a phenomena of this age, and that is attention deficit disorder, because it destroys a person's ability to think in a concentrated, linear fashion. Have you ever seen a child try these days, some people trying to read a book? It looks something like this. Can't stay away from the phone. It's very interesting. Some of our youth conferences, we do not let kids have phones. And that keeps some from coming. We say can't have laptops, screens. When it's time for you to be somewhere, we'll tell you. If there's something for you to watch, we'll show it to you. But we want you to interact with other people. We don't want you looking at screens. We don't want you, buried in your phone. And if your parents need you, they know how to reach you. They'll contact us. They'll let us know. It's like you're trying to break someone from a cocaine habit to get that away from them. But when you do, something beautiful and marvelous begins to happen. They begin to discover the world around them. And a lot of kids today just simply have not had that. Often the most influential thing in their life is their peers. And this is just as bad as the internet. James Dobson pointed out long ago, as a psychologist and a family expert, that peers have nothing positive to contribute to your children. They don't. When I was pushing back, here's a little admission. When I was pushing back on my wife, who was the one suggested that we homeschool, I thought it sounded kind of weird. And I was like, what? Homeschooling? She had been doing lots of research on it. And she'd been thinking it through really carefully. And when I said, I gave the standard answer. I said, well, I went to public school and I turned out okay. She said, when were you first bullied? I said, the school bus. It was terrible on the school bus. Lots of fighting on the school bus. She goes, When were you first exposed to pornography? At school, my peers. When were you first exposed to drugs? School party. And as she's going along, I'm getting quieter and quieter and quieter because she's cornered me and because I realize she's 100% correct. She's saying the good old school days really weren't all that great. And we need to be the most influential people in our children's lives. You don't want peers. That some people argue that socialization is what kids miss in homeschool. To me, in homeschooling, is to me the the greatest admission of all, that it's the best way to educate, because they're no longer arguing about the education. Those homeschool kids are outpacing every other educational demographic, so they can't win there. So what do? Is they say, well, they're weird. Well, they may seem weird because they're more mature, because they're not smoking crack, and because they're not peer dependent, and because they're more spiritually minded. Typically, it doesn't always work out that way. I'm not saying that if you homeschool your kids that it'll all turn out right. As I pointed out to you before, God, who is the perfect father, has the most wayward children. However, the problem we're seeing in the culture today, I dare say there are very few homeschool kids in the ranks of Antifa, in the ranks of BLM. There'd be very few of them there. Is it a Sunday school teacher? Is it a daycare worker? Who or what is the most influential thing in your child's life? It would be unwise to underestimate the influence these things can have. And it's very, very naive to do so. The world, you must understand, is filled with ideologies that are competing against you for the minds of your children. Are you winning the battle? How are you doing? As parents, you should be the most powerful influence in your child's life. But how are we to accomplish this? How are we to compete with all the worldly influences? Well, spending time with your children is very important, but it's not enough. Many unbelievers do as much. As Christians, we are commanded to raise our children differently. Well, we do it by making Deuteronomy 6:7 our number one parental priority. Deuteronomy 6 reduces the entire awesome task of parenting to this: teach your children about God, or impress his law upon them. The Hebrew word that's translated here as teach or impress, as into like imprint, is shenantum. A literal translation of the word is to sharpen. Psalm 127 says this: behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. Today, children, one of the greatest signs of societal, spiritual, moral decay is that children are now targets for indoctrination, for mutilation, and for terminating pregnancies. Our society has made war on children. The biblical view of children is that children are a blessing from God. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. At some point, I will do a show just talking about the war on reproduction. Depopulation has been a massive agenda in this country for more than a half century, much more than a half century. I love the imagery of Psalm 127 here. Children are like arrows in the hands of a warrior. If we faithfully teach our children, if we sharpen them, if we prepare them, equip them, then one day when they're ready, we can draw them from the quiver and aim them at a wicked world that is desperately seeking the answers they can provide. But how do we teach them? Well, again, Deuteronomy 6:7 gives us direction. You shall talk of them, God's precepts, his laws, when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And everywhere, in other words, everywhere and at all times. Now, what does that look like? Well, Lori and I have, as I mentioned, 4 grown children, our 3 boys and our daughter, Sasha. Some of you will know Sasha. I interviewed her in a podcast I don't know, year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. You can go take a look at, that. And I've also written about her in my book, The Grace Effect. The Grace Effect makes you a great Christmas present, by the way. The Grace Effect. You can check that out. And then, of course, there's our 3 boys. All of them are married. All 4 of our children are married. 3 have children of their own. All of them are thriving in faith. And we homeschooled them, as I say, back when homeschooling seemed kind of, cultish. But we taught our children that practically everything has a philosophy. And it was a way of making conversation with them, just in the simple day-to-day things. So when Scripture is telling you to teach them, it doesn't mean necessarily that you sit them down at the kitchen table and mom gets a dry erase board. And, might mean that. There's certainly a time and place for that. But it just simply means, the opportunity to have a conversation with them while you're throwing baseball, when you're driving to the grocery store, conversation with them about the things they're observing in the culture that you're observing. And that you have the opportunity to ask them, what do you think that was all about? What did you learn from that? So with our own children, we made a habit of discussing literature and movies with them. And we'd ask them later, we'd go see a movie and say, what do you think the message of that movie was? What do you think the messaging of that was? I remember the advertisement Twix had. Twix, 2 for me, none for you. It's actually funny, but there is a philosophy being promoted there. And so you just ask them, what do you think? What do you think that's about? Selfishness, Dad. I think it's about selfishness. You're getting them to process the things that are taking place around them rather than them just letting the culture spew its messages and penetrate them like so many X-rays, like gamma rays just going right through them. But instead, you're prompting them to process it. What did you think of that? You deserve a break today at McDonald's. What do you think that means? I think it means entitlement, Dad. I think it's saying that you're entitled to a break. Well, do you think you're entitled to a break? Have you worked hard? Are you deserving of a break today? You can have such fascinating conversation. By the way, you can have these conversations with young people very early, because once kids start talking, they are processing the world around them way more than you think they are. And you can have some really interesting and highly entertaining conversations with them about the things that are going on around them. And by the way, Scripture says, out of the mouths of babes, sometimes great spiritual truths come. I'm reminded with my son, who was my eldest son, Michael, who's now a litigator. we're sitting and we're watching. I'm not exactly. I have searched all over YouTube to find this commercial, and I cannot find it anywhere. I've had other people look for it, and they can't find it either. But it's a commercial. There's one that looks similar to it, but it's not it. It's a Saab commercial. And we were watching a football game or something, and then this commercial comes on. There's this Saab convertible that's going down what looks like the California coast, waves crashing into the rocks, this cool, winding highway, a handsome couple. He's wearing sunglasses, and he looks over at her, and she looks over at him, and then she starts taking off articles of clothing and holding them one by one up into the wind, and they're all getting, they're all being taken out of her hand, and he's kind of looking at her slyly, and she's looking back slyly at him, and it's this sexy moment. And then the camera pans out, and you see the car heading down the highway, and it said no words throughout the entire commercial, and it says Saab. So I turn to my son and I say, what do you think that commercial was saying? What's the message of that one? He said, well, Dad, it's saying if you buy a Saab convertible, that beautiful women will take their clothes off in your car. That's exactly what it was saying. He nailed it. He processed it. And I kid you not, maybe 3 years later, he called me up and said, Dad, hear me out. There's this Saab convertible I've seen. It's used and it's for sale. And I said, no, click. To this day, he's defensive. If he's watching now, he's defensive right now as it comes up. But Saab's messaging was very clear. But you're teaching them to process the things around you. But not only that, that you're teaching them to process it through a biblical lens. Think about the things that are taking place. What does that song mean? What does that song mean? What is it saying in that particular song? I do that with songs all the time. Songs are playing on the radio. I'm a guy who listens to lyrics. And if I'm particularly interested, I might look them up. Used to, you couldn't do that. They would have, some of you will know what I'm talking about, in the cassette, there'd be a little paper that you could unfold. It would have a, tiny, 2-point font that would sometimes have the lyrics to the songs. Otherwise, you'd find yourself, singing something that wasn't right at all. You thought you knew the words, and what you were singing made absolutely no sense and bared no resemblance to the actual words of the song. But you have an opportunity to ask them, what is that song saying? What does it mean? What message is being promoted there? And it gets them thinking. And then you have the opportunity to say, well, how does that compare with what the Bible has to say? What do you think Jesus would say about that song? You have wonderful opportunities for conversation. But see, what you're doing is you're helping them to engage the culture around them, and you're starting to give them confidence in the way they understand it, rather than being overwhelmed by it. Because one day, I hear parents say this all the time, and it irritates me endlessly. Well, you can't shelter them. Well, Dad, just what do you think your job actually is? Your job is to shelter them until such time that you have to let go of their hand and let them go out into the world on their own. And I will tell you now, at age 58, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm still parenting. My children are all grown, but I'm still parenting. Parenting, I discover, really never ends until that time that your children kind of become the parent for you. But your wisdom is still needed. Your input is still needed. And by that, I don't mean just simply casting judgment. I mean because you might see them doing something and you think to yourself, I know how this is going to play out. I remember this stage of parenting. I remember having a child that was this age. And I could intervene here and offer some counsel. I remember another parent whom I respected saying to me many years ago, after our eldest was born, And I don't recall what we were doing, but we were chatting, and Michael was running around in a diaper. And he said to me, Larry, I never ask my children to do something I'm not willing to enforce. That was great advice. Meaning, if you are not prepared, if you're to make sure that they take the garbage out, then don't ask them to take it out. Because when your children are allowed to disobey you, they learn contempt for authority rather than respect for authority. And that means you have to follow through. And sometimes you might say to yourself, I don't have time in this particular moment. It will get to a point where when you've disciplined, raised your children properly, you don't have to go check because you know they're going to do it. But early on, you have to be prepared to enforce your rules. And I would add to this, by the way, keep your rules to a minimum. Keep your rules to a minimum. We took the view that's contrary to the culture with our own children. The cultural expectation is that children, they get to sit like, judges poolside at a diving competition and hold up, their scores. Well, I give that a 9. I give that sermon an 8. I give that meal a 6. I give that vacation a 6.5. The expectation, the cultural expectation that children are allowed to simply be consumers into their teens, 20s, and even into their 30s, sitting at home on the couch playing video games is a disaster. It's a disaster. We took the view very early on that our children could assume responsibility, and we would expect them to. And not in some kind of authoritarian and oppressive way, but because we wanted to teach our children pride in work and reward. When I was in graduate school, and Michael and Christopher's child's number 2 in our family, were young. I was beyond this by the time Zachary and Sasha came along. But I was teaching university, I was waiting tables, and I was painting houses in the summer to make money. And I would bring them along. And Michael, as young as 8 years old, would be there. I would give him the cordless screwdriver, and I would send him around to take all of the light switch covers off and the outlet covers off. And I remember the owner coming in and saying, you got your little boy here. What does he do? And I said, well, he helps. And she said, little kids don't do anything. And then a few minutes later, after watching him, she said, I forget that. She says, wow, he's very helpful. And I said, yes, he is. I've taught him to do these things. He goes around and takes them off. I give him brushes. I ask him to go and clean them and to fetch me this or to fetch me that. And then in between, he can read a book. Or he can go outside and, kick a ball around or do whatever. But he takes pride in what he's doing. He likes to see that it's done right because it's his job. He knows it's his job, and he likes knowing that. He takes pride in that. Your children will learn a proper work ethic. They will learn a proper work ethic. They will learn pride, and they will learn self-respect. I promise you, a lot of these kids today that we are seeing protesting in the street, they hate themselves as much as they hate everybody else. They have very little self-respect. And it's because they've never been taught it. And so they're casting around seeking purpose. Seeking purpose. Be honest with your children about your failures, moral or otherwise. Be honest with them. Doesn't mean you have to go into gory detail about that, but you want to speak to them of your failures. They'll respect you for that. And of God's forgiveness and your restoration. I know far too many people who can recall some misdeed in their own life. They did drugs when they were in high school or college or some other time, or they slept around, or they did this or they did that, and they feel robbed of moral authority. So when their children are misbehaving, they say nothing because they feel like they can't. All the more reason you need to speak up. All the more reason you need to speak up. And you can speak up not by acting self-righteous, not by acting holier than thou, but saying, son, I know why you want to do those things. Don't think I don't understand that, because I actually did do some of those things, and I've lived to regret it. I remember a friend of mine telling me that before he went off to college, his dad said to him, when I was in university and had the opportunity to sleep with every woman, big man on campus, he said, I did. And I've lived to regret it, because I can't even remember the names of some of those women, but their faces come back to me at the most inopportune times. And they now affect, though your mother has never asked, it now affects the intimacy that I would like to have with her, but can't. He said, boy, did that hit me like a ton of bricks, because I knew it was hard for my father to say this. He said, I could see him working up to it. When he came into my room and started looking around, I was like, Dad, is there a reason you're in here while I'm packing? Is there something you want to tell me? And he said he saw his dad, who was a big man, take a deep breath and then say this to him. That's parenting. That's good parenting. That is a father who loves a child and says, please don't do what I've done. Don't do it. You will live to regret it. Do not let prior moral failures rob you of moral authority with your children. Be honest with your children. They will respect you for it. I promise you they will. They'll hurt for you, actually, because they will understand. They will understand. More than that, you're giving them solid footing for when the storm comes and breaks against their lives. And I promise you, at some point it will. So at some point it will. And knowing that you, as a Christian, were working through your own faith, had your own struggles, will do them so much good. Remember when I told you that I went to this Antifa meeting, and I came away with this feeling of sadness, because I realized, again, this was kind of Antifa light. They weren't, chucking Molotov cocktails at anything or anybody, if indeed that's really what this was all about. But all of that said, what I realized was these are individuals who are longing for purpose. They're longing to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And the irony of all of that is they've rejected Christianity when no one offers a bigger mission than Jesus Christ. No one. I loved what Stephen Curtis Chapman called it in a song he wrote back in the 1990s, The Great Adventure. The Great Adventure. God calls you, he calls your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to join him in an invasion of reclaiming this earth in his name. He calls us to that. He calls us to that great mission. He calls us to engage. I'm very clear on my own personal mission. I know exactly what my calling is, and I have no doubts as it relates to that. I don't struggle with any wondering about what it is that I'm supposed to do with my life. Sometimes I struggle doing it, but I don't struggle with knowing what it is. And kids are looking for meaning. And you can give them that. It isn't just simply something I really want to communicate as it relates to this. I think far too many parents today, Christian parents, are just thinking they want to hunker down and just survive parenting. That's not what I'm trying to give to you today. I'm not about just trying to survive. We're talking about taking the offensive. We told our children when they were young, we are preparing you like arrows in the hands of a warrior. We are sharpening you because one day we are going to draw you from the quiver and aim you at a wicked world that is seeking the answers that you can provide. We want our children to penetrate the corridors of power. We want them to have influence and to change the lives of people around them, even as they themselves are being changed and growing, even as they themselves have their own struggles, even as they have to repent from time to time. But now they've been given the formula and they know how to do it. They know that when Scripture says, seek and you shall find, that God means it, that it's real. We aren't just playing defense. We are playing offense and reclaiming a fallen world. It isn't an easy task. Indeed, there will be consequences. One Christian author put it well when he wrote this. The consequences of doing what is right in this world will eventually catch up to you. You'll miss a promotion or two. The socialites will mark you off the party list. Being faithful will cost you something. And when you have to take the heat for your stands, your children will be able to watch their parents endure the hardship of being true to their convictions. But it is in those moments that the fire of faith is handed down. The torch of God's truth is passed from one generation to another, not during the good times, but in the heat of the battle. So true. If you remember nothing else about what I've had to say today, remember this. In the end, the only thing that has eternal significance, indeed, the only thing that has eternal consequences, is whether you have conveyed to your children the Christian message or not. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.